Mr. Miller, I'm very sorry to have to tell you this, but the test shows that you are not Jake's biological father. The words seemed to suck the air out of the room. I heard a sound escape from Michael, something between a sob and a groan, and when I looked at him, his face had crumpled, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Are you certain?" he managed to ask, his voice breaking. "I'm certain," Dr. Evans said gently. "The genetic markers are clear. There is no biological relationship between you and Jake." I watched my husband, this man who had remained stoic through 18 years of a dead marriage, who had never once broken down in front of me despite the pain I had caused him, completely fall apart. His shoulders shook with sobs, and he buried his face in his hands. "Oh, God," he kept saying. "Oh, God. Oh, God." I sat in the sterile quiet of Dr. Evans' clinic office, my fingers unconsciously twisting the strap of my purse as sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting neat stripes across the white walls. At 58, I had just retired from teaching, expecting this routine physical to be nothing more than a formality, a simple checkmark on my transition into a new chapter of life. Dr. Evans, a kind-looking woman in her 50s with gold-rimmed glasses, stared at her computer screen with a furrowed brow that made my stomach tighten with an unfamiliar dread. She glanced up at me, then back down, clicking through my electronic chart with a deliberate slowness that seemed to stretch each second into an eternity. When she finally spoke, confirming my age and recent retirement, her soft voice somehow set my teeth on edge, a warning bell I couldn't quite identify. I tried to keep my own voice steady as I asked if something was wrong, if she had found anything concerning in my test results, but her pause, those few seconds of weighted silence, felt like the calm before a devastating storm. Then came the question that would change everything. Dr. Evans looked at me with a complicated expression and asked something deeply personal. Had my husband and I maintained a normal, intimate life over the years? My face flushed hot immediately, the question finding its mark like a needle piercing the most secret and painful wound of the last 18 years. It was absurd, really, that a simple medical question could unearth such buried shame. Michael and I had been married for 30 years, but we had been strangers for 18 of them, living in the same house but existing in completely separate worlds. The question hung in the air between us, and I knew my silence was answer enough. Dr. Evans' face showed understanding mixed with professional concern, but she couldn't possibly grasp the full weight of what she was asking, the years of cold distance that her question had just excavated from my carefully constructed facade. Those 18 years of estrangement weren't the result of gradually drifting apart or the natural cooling of long-married couples. They were a punishment, a sentence I had accepted the moment Michael discovered my affair in the summer of 2008. I was 40 then, the same age as him, and our son Jake had just left for college, leaving behind a house that felt physically and psychologically empty. The vacuum his departure created had revealed something I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. That Michael and I, college sweethearts who had married right after graduation and fallen into a comfortable life, had become like a glass of lukewarm water. No waves, but no passion either. He worked as an engineer at a large manufacturing firm, while I taught English at the local high school, and our stable, quiet life had become suffocating in its predictability. Sitting in Dr. Evans' office, faced with her probing question, I realized that the past I had tried so desperately to bury was about to surface in ways I never could have anticipated.
When I was 40, I met Ethan, and he awakened something in me I thought had died years before. He was the new art teacher at the high school, 5 years younger than me, with fine lines that crinkled around his eyes when he smiled in that genuine way that seemed to light up entire rooms. There was something different about him, something that set him apart from the mundane routine of faculty meetings and grading papers. He kept a vase of fresh flowers on his desk, always changing with the seasons, and he hummed tunes I didn't recognize while grading papers, lost in his own world of creativity and beauty. He would offer his umbrella to anyone caught in the rain without a second thought, and in doing so, he reminded me of the girl I used to be 20 years earlier, the one who would cry over a poem, who daydreamed under the moonlight, who believed in romance and passion and all the things that marriage and motherhood and routine had slowly eroded away. One afternoon that changed everything, Ethan walked into my classroom holding a watercolor painting of a hillside covered in wildflowers, the colors vibrant and alive in a way that made my heart ache. When I told him it was beautiful, meaning every word, he simply handed it to me and said something that unlocked a door in my heart I had long since bolted shut. "I think you're like the wildflowers in this painting, quiet, but with a life force all your own." Those words reached into the depths of who I had once been and pulled that forgotten person back to the surface. We started talking more in the faculty lounge, having conversations that went beyond lesson plans and student behavior. We began strolling through the small school garden during lunch breaks, where he would point out details in flowers and trees that I had walked past 1,000 times without really seeing. We grabbed coffee at a nearby cafe, and those conversations stretched longer and longer, until I found myself looking forward to them more than anything else in my day. I knew it was wrong, of course I knew. I was a married woman, a mother, someone who should have known better. But I couldn't stop myself, because the feeling of being truly seen, of being admired and appreciated for who I was rather than what I did, was like rain falling on parched earth. Michael had sensed something was off, asking one evening from his usual spot on the couch why I was working late so much recently. I avoided his gaze as I hurried into the bedroom, mumbling something about school responsibilities, and he didn't press the issue. He just sat there, in the silent glow of the television, and that silence made me feel guilty, but paradoxically, it also made me bolder. If he wasn't going to fight for my attention, if he wasn't curious enough to dig deeper, then maybe what I was doing wasn't so wrong after all. That was the lie I told myself, the justification that allowed me to keep walking down a path that would eventually destroy everything I had built over the previous 20 years of marriage.
The whole thing blew up on a weekend that I had planned so carefully, constructing lies with a precision that now fills me with shame. I had told Michael I had a faculty workshop, knowing he wouldn't question it because he never questioned my professional commitments. In reality, I had arranged to go sketching with Ethan in the countryside, a romantic escape that I had been anticipating for weeks. We spent the entire afternoon by a lake, talking about poetry, art, and life with an intensity that made the hours dissolve like sugar in water. The sun was warm, the scenery was beautiful, and for those precious hours I felt young again, desired again, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. As dusk fell and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Ethan suddenly took my hand, his touch sending electricity through my entire body. "Susan, But his words were cut short by a voice that shattered the moment like glass hitting concrete. "Mom." I whipped my head around, my heart stopping completely in my chest. Jake was standing a short distance away, his face pale with fury, and next to him stood Michael, my husband of 20 years. Michael's face was a blank mask, carefully controlled and expressionless, but his eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. In that single moment, I watched my entire world collapse. My mind went white, unable to process what was happening, unable to form coherent thoughts beyond the primal panic of being caught. It turned out that Jake had come home from college for the weekend to surprise me, a loving gesture from a son who missed his mother. When I didn't answer my phone, because I had silenced it to avoid interruptions during my time with Ethan, he had asked Michael to drive him around to my usual spots to find me. And they had found me here, by this beautiful lake, holding hands with another man. Home. That was all Michael said before turning and walking back to the car, his back straight and rigid with controlled emotion. The ride back was terrifyingly silent, the kind of silence that pressed down on your chest and made it hard to breathe. Jake sat in the back seat radiating disappointment and anger so palpable I could feel it like a physical force.
Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught his eye, he would look away with disgust, and it felt like a knife twisting in my heart. My son, my precious boy, who I had raised and nurtured and loved with everything in me, now looked at me like I was a stranger, like I was someone he couldn't recognize. When we got home, Michael sent Jake to his room with a quiet firmness that left no room for argument. Then he sat on the living room sofa, lit a cigarette, something I hadn't seen him do in years, and looked at me with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition, nothing but a cold, calculated assessment of a situation that needed to be managed.
How long? Michael's voice was calm, measured, controlled, and that scared me more than yelling would have, more than rage or violence or any of the reactions I had braced myself for. I knelt in front of him on the living room floor, tears streaming down my face, my body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal. "I'm sorry," I choked out, the words inadequate and pathetic in the face of what I had done. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." But he simply repeated his question. "I asked you how long." The words were precise, clinical, as if he were conducting an interview rather than confronting his wife's betrayal. 3 months, I sobbed, my voice breaking. But nothing happened. I swear, we just talked. It was technically true. Ethan and I had never been physically intimate, but even as I said it, I knew how hollow it sounded, how the emotional betrayal was perhaps even worse than a physical one would have been. Enough. Michael stubbed out his cigarette with a decisive motion and stood up, looking down at me kneeling on the floor. "Susan, I'm giving you 2 choices. 1, we divorce. You walk away with nothing." I stared at him, stunned by the coldness in his voice, by the way he was already thinking several steps ahead while I was still drowning in the immediate horror of being caught. 2, we stay married, but from this day forward we are roommates, not husband and wife. The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with precision. He continued, his tone as cold and detached as if he were discussing a business deal rather than the dissolution of our marriage. "Jake has his whole life ahead of him. I don't want this to affect him, and a divorce wouldn't look good for your job either. So I'm giving you this choice. If you don't agree, we'll get a divorce." The calculation in his words was terrifying. He had already thought through all the angles, all the consequences, and had come up with this solution in the time it took to drive home. I agree," I heard myself whisper, my voice trembling with fear and shame. The moment I said those words, something shifted in the room, in our relationship, in the entire foundation of our shared life. "Then it's settled," Michael said, with a finality that made my stomach drop. He walked into our bedroom, gathered his pillow and a comforter, and threw them onto the living room sofa with motions that were efficient and emotionless. "From now on, I sleep out here. Your life is your own, but in front of our son and in front of everyone else, you will act like a normal wife." That night, I lay alone in our king-sized bed, the emptiness beside me feeling like a chasm that would never be filled. I listened to him tossing and turning on the couch, and I had expected him to scream, to hit me, to demand more answers. But he did none of those things. He simply shut me out of his world, and for the first time, I understood that some punishments were far crueler than divorce could ever be.
The next day, Michael went to work as if nothing had happened. His routine unchanged, his face a mask of professional composure that must have cost him tremendous effort to maintain. I called in sick, unable to face Ethan, unable to face my colleagues, unable to function in the normal world when my private world had just imploded. I sent Ethan a single text, my fingers shaking as I typed. "I'm sorry, we can't see each other again." His reply came quickly, just one word. "Okay." And just like that, my affair with Ethan was over, but my marriage to Michael was too, at least in any meaningful sense. The man I had been married to for 20 years was gone, replaced by a polite stranger who happened to share my living space. In the years that followed, we maintained a strange, cold peace that was more exhausting than open warfare would have been.
Michael would make coffee in the morning, the machine gurgling to life before dawn, but he wouldn't speak to me, wouldn't acknowledge my presence beyond the bare minimum required for cohabitation. He would come home from work on time, his schedule regular and predictable, but he would disappear into his study until I was asleep, working on projects or reading or doing anything that kept him away from me. Only after he heard my bedroom door close would he emerge to claim his spot on the living room couch, and in the morning the blankets would be neatly folded as if no one had slept there at all. When Jake came home for Christmas break that first year, the atmosphere in our house was arctic, the cold so pervasive you could almost see your breath. I asked Jake what he wanted for dinner, trying to sound cheerful and maternal, desperate to connect with my son who now looked at me like I was a stranger. He just looked at me and said, "Whatever," before shutting himself in his room, the door closing with a finality that echoed through the empty house. That Christmas, the three of us sat in silence during dinner, the only sound coming from the holiday movie playing on the television, its cheerful music a mockery of our family's devastation. "Jake, have some more turkey," I said, reaching to put food on his plate, still trying to perform the role of mother, even though my son clearly wanted nothing to do with me. He pulled his plate away, keeping his head down, refusing to make eye contact. "Dad, how are things at the firm?" he asked, pointedly ignoring me, directing all his attention and conversation toward Michael. "Fine," Michael answered curtly, his responses to Jake only slightly warmer than his complete silence toward me. "Good," Jake said, putting his fork down with a decisive clink. "I'm full, going to my room." Watching my son walk away, the tears started again, hot and unstoppable, streaming down my face. "Stop crying," Michael said flatly, not even looking at me. "Save your energy. We have to go to your mother's tomorrow." I wiped my eyes, a chilling realization dawning on me like cold water seeping into my bones. This was my life now, playing happy families for the world, living as strangers at home, forever caught between the performance and the reality.
Time passed, but unlike for most people, it didn't heal anything. It simply froze our relationship in place, preserving the pain and distance like insects trapped in amber. In 2011, Jake graduated with his master's degree and took a job in Chicago, moving hundreds of miles away to start his adult life. The house, now empty of our son's presence, felt even colder, even more hollow than before. Every room echoed with memories of what we used to be, of family dinners and laughter and the ordinary warmth of a functioning household. I tried to mend things with Michael, throwing myself into the role of devoted wife with a desperation that bordered on pathetic. I learned to cook his favorite meals, spending hours in the kitchen perfecting dishes I thought might soften his heart. I bought him thoughtful birthday gifts, carefully selected items that showed I still knew his preferences, his interests, his tastes. I waited up for him with a snack when he worked late, sitting in the dim kitchen with food growing cold, hoping he might stop and talk to me for even a few minutes. But my efforts bounced off him like rain off stone, making no impact whatsoever. "You don't have to do this," he said coldly one night when he found me waiting with homemade soup at midnight. "We're just acting. You understand that, right?" His words cut through my delusions like a knife through paper. "But I want to make it up to you," I choked out, my voice thick with unshed tears. "Some things can't be fixed," he cut me off, his tone final and absolute. "Susan, I gave you a respectable way out. Just live your life and don't make me regret my decision." The cruelty wasn't in his words themselves, but in how true they were, how they stripped away any hope I had been nursing that time might heal what my betrayal had broken. Years continued to pile up like snow, each one adding another layer of cold distance between us. 2015, 2018, 2020, the years blurred together in a monotonous parade of polite coexistence and public pretense. We attended family gatherings where we smiled and held hands, where Michael would put his arm around me with practiced ease, where we performed the role of the devoted couple so convincingly that people would comment on how lucky we were to still be so in love after all these years. At home,
We were ghosts haunting the same space, passing each other in hallways without making eye contact, existing in parallel universes that occasionally and unavoidably intersected. The only times we spoke were about practical matters, bills that needed paying, appointments that needed scheduling, obligations that required coordination. Our conversations were transactional, devoid of emotion or genuine connection, the verbal equivalent of business emails between strangers. I learned to live with the loneliness, the constant ache of being married to someone who treated me like an unfortunate roommate he was stuck with due to circumstances beyond his control. I learned to swallow my tears, to cry silently in the shower where he couldn't hear me, to maintain my composure during the day while falling apart at night. This was the punishment I had chosen, and I had no right to complain about it. In 2022, Jake married Sarah, a lovely young woman who brought genuine light into our fractured family dynamic. The wedding was beautiful, held in a garden with flowers blooming in brilliant colors, and I stood beside Michael, playing my role perfectly as we smiled for photographs and greeted guests. We danced together at the reception, his hand on my waist, feeling both familiar and foreign, moving through the motions of a couple who had been together for decades. People commented on how wonderful it was that Jake had such a solid example of lasting love in his parents, and Michael and I smiled and thanked them, the lies coming easily after years of practice. But later that night in our hotel room, he didn't say a word to me, simply took his pillow and slept in the armchair by the window, his back turned to me, maintaining the distance that had become as natural as breathing. A year later, their son Noah was born, and for the first time in 15 years, I saw Michael's face break into genuine emotion. He held that baby with a tenderness that made my heart ache, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his grandson. "Hi there, little man," he whispered, his voice thick with feeling. "I'm your grandpa." Watching him with Noah, I saw glimpses of the man he used to be, the man who had held our own son with that same wonder and love. But when he looked at me holding Noah, his face would close off again, the warmth draining away, replaced by the familiar cold indifference. We fell into a new routine, one that revolved around being grandparents while still maintaining our careful distance. We visited Chicago regularly, and in front of Jake and Sarah, we were the picture-perfect grandparents, doting and affectionate with each other as well as with Noah. Michael would hold my hand as we walked through the park with the stroller, and to anyone watching, we were simply a loving couple enjoying their golden years together. But the moment we were alone in the guest room, he would move to the opposite side of the space, putting as much distance between us as the room allowed. He never slept in the same bed as me, always finding an excuse. The armchair was more comfortable. He didn't want to disturb me with his snoring. He wanted to read late. The excuses varied, but the result was always the same. We never touched, never shared intimacy, never connected on any level beyond the performative. I had grown accustomed to this half-life, this existence where I played the role of wife and mother and grandmother while being fundamentally alone. I told myself it was enough, that I deserved this punishment, that I should be grateful Michael had chosen this path instead of divorce. But gratitude is a difficult emotion to sustain when you're living with someone who looks through you rather than at you, who treats you with careful politeness rather than any genuine feeling. Still, I had made my choice that night 18 years ago when I agreed to his terms, and I had no right to complain about the consequences now.
Then last month, everything shifted again when Jake called with news that made my blood run cold. "Dad had a heart attack," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled panic. "He collapsed at work. They rushed him to the hospital. You need to get here now." I drove to Chicago in a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. What if he died? What if the last words we had spoken to each other were about grocery lists and utility bills? What if I never got the chance to tell him? What? That I was sorry? I had said that 1,000 times and it had never mattered. That I loved him? Did I even have the right to say that anymore after what I had done? When I arrived at the hospital, Sarah met me in the waiting area, her eyes red from crying. "He's stable now," she said, pulling me into a hug that I desperately needed. But it was close, really close. She led me to his room, where Jake sat beside the bed, holding his father's hand, and the scene broke something in me that had somehow remained intact through all the years of distance. Michael was asleep, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that beeped with reassuring regularity, his face pale against the white hospital pillow. Jake looked up when we entered, and for the first time in years, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't anger or disappointment. It was fear, pure and simple, the fear of a son who had nearly lost his father. "Mom," he said quietly, and that single word, spoken with something almost like warmth, made tears stream down my face. I wanted to rush to Michael's bedside, to take his hand, to be the devoted wife I had pretended to be for so many years. But I couldn't move, frozen by the knowledge that I had no right to be there, no right to touch him, no right to claim any role in his recovery. Sarah gently guided me to a chair on the other side of the bed, and I sat there, looking at the man I had been married to for 30 years, the man whose life I had shared while remaining fundamentally separate from him. Over the next few days, Michael recovered slowly, and the doctors said he was lucky. The heart attack had been serious, but he would survive with proper care and lifestyle changes. During those days in the hospital, I brought him books he liked and helped adjust his pillows when the nurses were busy. He accepted my help with polite gratitude, the same tone he might use with any helpful stranger. "Thank you, Susan," he would say, his voice weak, but his emotional distance as strong as ever. Jake watched these interactions with an expression I couldn't read, something troubled and thoughtful, as if he was seeing something in our dynamic that he hadn't fully understood before. But he said nothing, simply focused on his father's recovery, and I was grateful for his silence because I didn't know how I would explain what we had become over the years. After Michael was released from the hospital, we returned home, and I scheduled my own routine physical exam that I had been putting off. That's when I found myself sitting in Dr. Evans' office, facing her uncomfortable question about my intimate life with Michael. The flush on my face must have told her everything she needed to know, but she pressed on gently, her professional demeanor softening with sympathy. "Susan, I need to be direct with you," she said, pulling up something on her computer screen. "Your test results show some abnormalities that are typically associated with long-term estrogen deficiency. In layman's terms, your body is showing signs consistent with someone who hasn't had sexual activity in a very long time." I sat there, humiliation washing over me in waves, unable to meet her eyes. "Is this dangerous?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not immediately life-threatening, but it does increase certain health risks," she explained, her tone kind but clinical. "However, that's not what concerns me most right now." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Susan, I also ran your standard blood work, and something unusual came up. I need to ask you some questions about your family medical history." My mind was still reeling from the first revelation, so I answered her questions mechanically, going through my parents' health histories, my siblings, my grandparents. She listened carefully, typing notes, her expression growing more troubled. "And your son, Jake, has he ever had any serious health issues?" The question seemed odd, but I told her about his childhood illnesses, nothing unusual, nothing serious. "What about genetic testing? Has he ever had any done?" Dr. Evans asked, her eyes never leaving mine. "No, why would he?" I asked, confusion cutting through my embarrassment. "What does Jake have to do with my test results?" Dr. Evans was silent for a long moment, her fingers steepled in front of her face, as if she was wrestling with a difficult decision. "Susan, I'm going to say something that may sound alarming, but I want you to hear me out completely before you react." My heart began to pound, a sense of dread settling over me like a heavy blanket. "Your blood work shows certain genetic markers that, when compared with standard inheritance patterns, suggest that there may be a question about biological relationships in your family." I stared at her, not understanding, my brain refusing to process what she was implying. "I don't understand what you're saying," I said slowly.
Susan, I think you should consider having genetic testing done, for you, for your husband, and for your son, she said carefully. The markers I'm seeing don't align with what I would expect given your medical history and your husband's background information from his records here. I could be wrong, this isn't a paternity test by any means, but the patterns are unusual enough that I think further investigation is warranted. The room seemed to tilt around me. Paternity test. The words hung in the air like an accusation, like a bomb that had just been dropped into the carefully constructed ruins of my life. You think Jake isn't Michael's son? I heard myself say, the words sounding distant and unreal.
I'm not saying that definitively, Dr. Evans said quickly, her voice gentle but firm. I'm simply saying there are questions that genetic testing could answer. It might be nothing. Genetic markers can be tricky, and without a full family panel, I can't be certain. But Susan, given what you've shared about your personal history, I thought you should know. I left her office in a daze, her words echoing in my mind like a death knell. The drive home was automatic, my body going through the motions while my mind spiraled into increasingly dark territory. Jake wasn't Michael's son. It couldn't be true. It couldn't be. I had been faithful for the first 20 years of our marriage, completely faithful, right up until Ethan. There had been no one else, no possibility of... But even as I thought it, something cold and terrible began to uncoil in my memory. The night before our wedding. Oh God, the night before our wedding. I had gone out with my bridesmaids for one last celebration, one last night of freedom before becoming Mrs. Michael Miller. We had gone to a bar, had too much to drink, danced and laughed and acted like the carefree college students we had so recently been. And there had been a man, a friend of a friend, someone whose name I could barely remember now through the haze of 30 years and deliberate forgetting. We had talked, we had danced, I pressed my hands against my eyes, trying to force the memory back into the darkness where I had buried it for 3 decades. Nothing had happened. I had told myself that for 30 years. We had kissed, maybe, in a dark corner of that bar, but I had stopped it, had pushed him away, had gone home alone. At least, that's what I had always told myself. But the night was fuzzy with alcohol, and there were gaps in my memory, moments I couldn't account for, time that had simply disappeared into a blackout. I had woken up in my own bed the next morning with a pounding headache and fragmented memories, but I had dismissed it, buried it, never thought about it again because I was getting married that day and nothing else mattered. Michael and I had conceived Jake on our honeymoon in Hawaii, or at least that's what we had always believed. I had gotten pregnant immediately, within the first month of marriage, and we had been thrilled, thinking it was a sign of how perfect we were together, how blessed our union was. But if that night before the wedding, if something had happened that I couldn't remember, if Jake had been conceived then rather than in Hawaii, the timeline would still work. No one would have known. I wouldn't have known. Sitting in my car in the driveway of the house Michael and I had shared for decades, I felt the last remaining pieces of my world crumble around me. It wasn't just that I had cheated on Michael with Ethan 18 years ago. It was that I might have betrayed him before we even said our vows, and that betrayal might have resulted in the son he had raised and loved for 28 years, the son who might not even be his. For 3 days, I carried Dr. Evans' words like a stone in my chest, unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to think about anything else. I moved through the house like a ghost, and Michael, maintaining his usual distance, didn't seem to notice anything different about my behavior. Why would he? We barely spoke, barely looked at each other, barely acknowledged each other's existence beyond the necessary coordination of daily life. But this secret was different from the affair with Ethan, different from the 18 years of cold silence. This secret, if it was true, would destroy not just what remained of our marriage, but Michael's entire understanding of his life, his identity as a father, his relationship with the son he adored. I thought about saying nothing, about burying Dr. Evans' suspicions along with all the other secrets I had accumulated over the years. Who would it hurt if I never pursued the genetic testing? Jake was Michael's son in every way that mattered, raised by him, loved by him, shaped by him. Biology was just biology, wasn't it? But every time I looked at Michael,
Every time I watched him FaceTime with Jake and Noah, I felt the weight of this potential lie crushing me. He had already sacrificed so much because of my betrayal with Ethan, had already endured 18 years of a hollow marriage for Jake's sake. Didn't he deserve to know the truth, whatever it might be? Or was the truth just another form of cruelty, another way of destroying whatever fragile piece we had managed to construct from the wreckage of our relationship? I made an appointment with a therapist, something I had never done before, desperate for guidance from someone who could be objective. Dr. Patricia Morrison was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. I told her everything: the affair with Ethan, the 18 years of estrangement, Dr. Evans' revelation, the night before my wedding that I could barely remember. She listened without judgment, taking occasional notes, her face thoughtful. "Susan, I'm going to ask you a difficult question," she said when I finished. "What do you want to happen here? If you could write the ending to this story, what would it look like?" I sat with the question, really sat with it, forcing myself to be honest. "I want to go back in time and never cheat on Michael," I said finally. "I want to go back even further and never get drunk that night before my wedding. I want Jake to be Michael's biological son. I want my marriage to be real instead of a performance. But none of those things are possible." Dr. Morrison nodded slowly. "You're right. You can't change the past, but you can choose what you do with the present. The question is, whose peace of mind are you trying to protect by keeping this secret? Your own or Michael's?" The answer was obvious, shamefully obvious. I was protecting myself from Michael's reaction, from Jake's hatred, from the final destruction of whatever remained of my family. "You already know what you have to do," Dr. Morrison said gently. "The question is whether you have the courage to do it." That night, I waited for Michael to come home from work, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When he walked through the door, setting down his briefcase with his usual efficiency, I stood up from the couch on shaking legs. "Michael, we need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. He looked at me with mild surprise. We didn't do this, didn't have conversations, didn't talk about anything beyond logistics. "I need to tell you something, and you're going to want to sit down." Something in my tone must have conveyed the seriousness because he actually stopped, actually looked at me directly for the first time in months, his expression wary. "What is it?" he asked, remaining standing, maintaining his distance. I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to say would change everything, would potentially destroy. That night, I waited for Michael to come home from work, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When he walked through the door, setting down his briefcase with his usual efficiency, I stood up from the couch on shaking legs. "Michael, we need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. He looked at me with mild surprise. We didn't do this, didn't have conversations, didn't talk about anything beyond logistics. "I need to tell you something, and you're going to want to sit down." Something in my tone must have conveyed the seriousness because he actually stopped, actually looked at me directly for the first time in months, his expression wary. "What is it?" he asked, remaining standing, maintaining his distance. I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to say would change everything, would potentially destroy the last remaining threads holding our family together. "I went to the doctor recently, for my retirement physical," I began, my words coming out in a rush, "and she found something in my blood work, something about genetic markers that didn't align properly, and she suggested that we get genetic testing done, all of us, you, me, and Jake." I watched his face, watching for comprehension, for understanding, for the moment when he would grasp what I was really saying. "Why would we need genetic testing?" he asked slowly, his engineer's mind working through the implications. What exactly did she find? I forced myself to meet his eyes, to not look away from what I was about to do. She thinks there might be questions about Jake's paternity." The words fell into the space between us like stones into a well, and I watched Michael's face go through a series of transformations: confusion, disbelief, understanding, and finally a cold fury that made my blood freeze. "What did you do?" His voice was quiet, deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded explosions. "Michael, I need to tell you about the night before our wedding." And then I told him everything I could remember, and everything I couldn't. I told him about the bar, about my bridesmaids, about too much alcohol and the man whose name I couldn't even remember. I told him about the gaps in my memory, about waking up the next morning with a sense that something had happened but no clear recollection of what. I told him about how I had buried it, had convinced myself it was nothing, had never thought about it again for 30 years. "You're telling me," Michael said, his voice shaking now with barely controlled rage, "that not only did you cheat on me with Ethan 18 years ago, but you might have cheated on me the night before our wedding, and Jake, my son, might not even be mine?" "I don't know," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I honestly don't know. That's why we need the test. We need to know the truth." Michael stood there, his whole body rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a long moment I thought he might actually hit me, might finally unleash all the rage and pain he had been holding back for 18 years. But instead, he did something worse. He laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor, empty and broken.
30 years, Michael said, still with that terrible, hollow laugh. 30 years I've been living a lie. Not 18 years, not since Ethan, but 30 goddamn years. From the very beginning. He turned away from me, his hands going to his head as if trying to hold his skull together. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you have any concept of what you're telling me right now?" I couldn't speak. Couldn't do anything but stand there and watch him fall apart in a way he hadn't even after catching me with Ethan. "I need to sit down," he said finally, moving to the couch like an old man, his movements stiff and uncertain. "I need you to explain to me exactly what the doctor said, every word." So I did, recounting Dr. Evans' careful explanation of genetic markers and inheritance patterns, her suggestion that we pursue definitive testing to be certain. Michael listened with his eyes closed, his face a mask of pain. "And if the test shows that Jake isn't mine?" he asked when I finished. "What then, Susan? What happens to our son when he finds out that his entire existence has been based on a lie? That his mother was so drunk the night before her wedding that she doesn't even remember if she slept with another man?" The words were cruel, but they were also true, and I had no defense against them. "I don't know," I admitted. "But don't we owe him the truth? Don't we owe you the truth?" Michael opened his eyes and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Something beyond anger, beyond hurt, something that looked almost like pity. "You really don't understand, do you? The truth isn't going to set anyone free, Susan. The truth is just going to destroy whatever fragments of our family still remain." But even as he said it, I could see him processing, calculating, making decisions with that analytical mind that had served him so well in his career. "We'll do the test," he said finally. "But we do it quietly, privately, and we don't tell Jake until we have the results. If he's mine, he never needs to know about this. If he's not—" He couldn't finish the sentence. We arranged for the testing through a private laboratory, paying extra for expedited results and complete confidentiality. The actual process was simple, just a cheek swab for each of us, but the weight of what we were doing made it feel monumental. Michael and I gave our samples separately, not even able to be in the same room together anymore. The waiting period was 2 weeks, 14 days that stretched like an eternity. Michael moved his things out of the house entirely, checking into a hotel. "I can't be around you right now," he said when I tried to protest. "I can't even look at you without wanting to—" He didn't finish, just grabbed his suitcase and left. Those 2 weeks were the loneliest of my life, lonelier even than the 18 years of cold silence because at least then Michael had been physically present. Now I was truly alone,
rattling around in a house that felt like a mausoleum, waiting for results that would either confirm my worst fears or provide a reprieve I didn't deserve. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function beyond the bare minimum required to survive. I called in sick to my part-time retirement job, unable to face other people, unable to pretend that everything was fine.
The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Evans herself called, her voice somber and professional. "Susan, the results are in. Can you and Michael come to my office tomorrow morning?" I called Michael at his hotel, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. "They have the results," I said when he answered. "Tomorrow at 10. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I'll be there," he said finally, and hung up. That night was the longest of my life, every minute dragging by with excruciating slowness. I ran through every possible scenario in my mind, what I would say if Jake wasn't Michael's, how I would explain it to our son, whether Michael would divorce me now or continue the charade. But more than anything, I thought about Jake, about the beautiful, brilliant man we had raised, about how this truth might destroy him. We arrived at Dr. Evans' office separately the next morning, Michael looking like he hadn't slept in days, his face drawn and haggard. We sat in her office in silence, not looking at each other, waiting for her to deliver the verdict on our lives. Dr. Evans came in with a folder, her expression carefully neutral. "Thank you both for coming," she said, sitting down behind her desk. "I want to preface this by saying that the results are definitive. The test we ran has a 99.9% accuracy rate." She opened the folder, and I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. "Mr. Miller, I'm very sorry to have to tell you this, but the test shows that you are not Jake's biological father." The words seemed to suck all the air out of the room. I heard a sound escape from Michael, something between a sob and a groan, and when I looked at him, his face had crumpled, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Are you certain?" he managed to ask, his voice breaking. "I'm certain," Dr. Evans said gently. "The genetic markers are clear. There is no biological relationship between you and Jake." I watched my husband, this man who had remained stoic through 18 years of a dead marriage, who had never once broken down in front of me despite the pain I had caused him, completely fall apart. His shoulders shook with sobs, and he buried his face in his hands. "Oh God," he kept saying, "oh God, oh God." I reached out to touch his shoulder, to offer some comfort, but he flinched away from me like I had burned him. "Don't," he said through his tears. "Don't you dare touch me. This is your fault. All of it. Everything." Dr. Evans discreetly left the room, giving us privacy for our grief. Michael stood up, pacing like a caged animal, his hands pulling at his hair. 28 years, he said, his voice raw with anguish. 28 years I've been raising another man's son. Every birthday, every school play, every proud moment, every time I told people about my son, it was all a lie. "He's still your son," I said desperately. "Biology doesn't change the fact that you raised him, that you love him, that he loves you." Michael stopped pacing and looked at me with such hatred that I actually stepped back. "You took everything from me, Susan. Everything. My marriage, my dignity, and now my son. What's left? What do I have left?"
Michael didn't speak to me for 3 days after we received the results. He stayed at his hotel, wouldn't answer my calls, left my texts on read. When he finally called, his voice was flat, emotionless, completely dead. "We need to tell Jake," he said. "He deserves to know, and we need to do it together." We arranged to fly to Chicago that weekend, telling Jake and Sarah that we needed to talk to them about something important. On the phone, Jake sounded concerned. "Is everything okay? Is someone sick?" And I had to lie. Had to say everything was fine, we just needed to discuss some family matters. The flight to Chicago was torture, sitting next to Michael in tense silence, while my mind raced with all the possible ways this conversation could go. When we arrived at Jake and Sarah's house, our son greeted us with a hug, and I felt Michael stiffen beside me, felt him struggling with the knowledge that the young man embracing him wasn't actually his biological child. "Dad, you look terrible," Jake said, concern evident in his voice. "Are you sure you're okay?" We sat down in their living room, Sarah bringing coffee that no one touched. Little Noah was at daycare, giving us privacy for what was about to be the most difficult conversation of our lives. "Jake," Michael began, his voice carefully controlled, "your mother and I need to tell you something, and there's no easy way to say it." I watched our son's face, watching his expression shift from concern to confusion to growing alarm. "What's going on? You're scaring me." So we told him. I explained about the doctor's appointment, about the genetic markers, about the night before the wedding that I couldn't fully remember. Michael explained about the test we had taken, about the results we had received, and then we told him the truth, that Michael was not his biological father. Jake sat perfectly still as we talked, his face going paler and paler until he looked like he might pass out. Sarah gripped his hand, her own face shocked and dismayed. When we finished, there was a long, terrible silence. "Say something," I finally whispered, unable to bear it any longer. Jake looked up at me, and the expression on his face made me wish I had never been born. "How dare you?" he said quietly. "How dare you tell me this?" He stood up, backing away from us like we were contaminated. "My entire life has been a lie. Everything I thought I knew about who I am, where I came from, it's all been a lie. And you," he turned to me, his voice rising, "you did this. You got drunk and slept with some random stranger the night before your wedding, and then you just, forgot about it? Pretended it didn't happen? Let Dad raise me thinking I was his son for 28 years? "Jake, please," Michael said, standing up, reaching for him, but Jake jerked away. "Don't," he said, his voice breaking. "Just don't." He turned to Sarah. "I need you to take them to a hotel. I can't be here with them right now. I can't even look at them." Sarah, tears streaming down her own face, nodded. "Of course, sweetheart, whatever you need." As she gathered our things and prepared to drive us away, I looked back at my son, Michael's son, in every way that mattered except biology, and saw him standing in his living room, his world shattered around him, and I knew that this was it. This was the moment when I lost him forever. Sarah drove us to a hotel in complete silence, her hands tight on the steering wheel. When we pulled up to the entrance, she finally spoke. "I don't know what to say to you both," she said quietly. "I don't know how to process any of this, but I need you to understand something. Jake needs time, a lot of time. Don't call, don't text, don't try to fix this right now. He'll reach out when he's ready, if he's ready." We checked into separate rooms and I sat alone in mine, staring at the walls, waiting for something, anything to happen. The call came 2 days later from Sarah, her voice tight with panic. "Jake collapsed. We're at the hospital. It's his heart. You need to come now." We rushed to the hospital to find Jake in intensive care, hooked up to machines just like Michael had been months before. The stress of the revelation had triggered a cardiac episode, the doctor said, compounded by an underlying condition he hadn't known he had. An underlying condition that wasn't genetic because Michael wasn't his biological father, so they hadn't been watching for it. I stood outside his room, watching through the glass as Michael sat beside the bed, holding Jake's hand, talking to him in low, urgent tones. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the love on Michael's face, the desperate fear of a father watching his son fight for his life. Blood or no blood, Jake was his son, and that truth was written in every line of Michael's body as he kept vigil. Sarah found me in the waiting room, and to my surprise, she sat down beside me and put her arm around my shoulders. "Jake told me everything," she said softly. "He said that no matter what the blood test says, Michael will always be his only father, and you will always be his only mother. He said the love was real, even if the biology wasn't." Her words should have comforted me, but they only made me cry harder, because I knew what they cost Jake to say, knew the generosity of spirit it took to look past my betrayal and see the years of genuine love that had come after. Michael came out of Jake's room hours later, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. He looked at me standing there and, for the first time in days, really looked at me. "He's stable," he said quietly. "He's going to be okay." Then, to my complete shock, he added, "We need to talk, really talk, for the first time in 18 years. We found an empty consultation room and Michael closed the door behind us. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. About everything. About the affair with Ethan, about Jake, about the last 18 years, about all of it. And I realized something watching Jake in that hospital bed. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I wanted to hate you. I wanted to kill you. I wanted to burn everything down and end it all. But Jake said something to me that I can't stop thinking about. He said, Dad, for the last 28 years, the love you gave me was real, and the love I gave you was real. That's enough. Michael's voice broke on the last words, and he had to stop, had to collect himself before continuing. He's right, Susan. The love was real. I raised him from birth. I taught him to ride a bike, helped him with his homework, walked him through his first heartbreak. I was there for every moment that mattered. Does biology really change any of that?
So I've decided to let you go, Michael said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something that might have been resignation or might have been a kind of hard-won peace. And to let myself go too. He crushed an imaginary cigarette against the armrest, a gesture so familiar from years of watching him quit and restart the habit. Can we? I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. Can we go back? Michael laughed, but it was a hollow sound, emptied out by too many years of pain. Go back? Every single day of our past was built on a lie, Susan. There's no going back. Not to before Ethan, not to before the wedding, not to anywhere. We can only go forward from here. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with truth. Then what do we do? I asked, my heart breaking all over again, because I could see where this was leading, could see the end of our story approaching like a train in the distance. Michael was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the Chicago skyline. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, careful, as if he had thought through every word. Jake needs time to heal. Noah is still young. He needs a complete family, or at least the appearance of one. So we'll keep acting, just like we have for the past 18 years. In public, we are a loving couple. We are Jake's parents. We are Noah's grandparents. He turned to look at me, and I saw in his eyes a weariness that went bone deep. And at home? I asked, though I already knew the answer. At home, we are roommates. Just roommates. This time, for real. The words were the same ones he had spoken 18 years ago, but their weight was entirely different now. Back then, there had been anger, punishment, a desire to make me suffer for what I had done. Now there was only acceptance of an unbearable reality, a recognition that some things truly cannot be fixed, only endured. The days that followed fell into a new pattern, one that looked remarkably similar to the old pattern but felt fundamentally different. Michael was polite and distant, saying thank you and excuse me with the careful courtesy of strangers. We performed our roles with practiced precision, the doting grandparents, the devoted couple, the proud parents. At Christmas, we smiled for family photos. At Jake's bedside, we presented a united front. To the outside world, we were everything a long married couple should be. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the performance, we were nothing. Not enemies, not lovers, not even really friends. Just two people who had once shared a life and now shared only the ruins of what that life had been. I understood now, finally and completely, what Michael had known 18 years ago. Some punishments aren't loud arguments or dramatic confrontations. They are gentle distance, the kind that puts someone right beside you but keeps them a million miles away. And so this is where my story ends. Not with forgiveness or reconciliation, not with dramatic revelation or cathartic resolution, but with acceptance. I will spend every day of the rest of my life paying off a debt I incurred 30 years ago on a night I can't even fully remember. Whether Michael stays or leaves, whether Jake eventually forgives me or doesn't, whether our family heals or remains forever fractured, none of that changes what I did or who I became because of it. This is my ending, a life lived in the shadow of my own mistakes, a marriage that exists only in performance, and the knowledge that some wounds, once inflicted, never truly heal. They simply become part of who we are, scars we carry forward into whatever future remains. And I will carry mine until the day I die.